Welcome to your daily dose of nature with Natural Habitat Adventures. Our topic today, Digiscoping, distance photography with your phone. And it's my pleasure to introduce you to Drew McCarthy, coming to us from Idaho. Drew, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you tell everyone a little bit about yourself.
All right, Lee, thank you for that. And welcome everybody to your daily dose of nature. My name is Drew McCarthy, and today I am at my home here in Teutonia, Idaho. Anybody that's interested in seeing exactly where I am, you can go ahead and Google Maps Felt, Idaho, and just look east of that. And that's just about where my cabin is today. Very excited to be presenting. This is intended as an introduction to sort of nuts and bolts of digiscoping. There won't be a whole lot about photo editing. There will be another daily dose of nature coming soon that will cover more about editing photos on your smartphone. So stay tuned for that. But for today, we're going to go through some of the equipment that's necessary for digiscoping, go through some definitions, talk about what digiscoping is, and how you can get involved, because it is an excellent thing to do from home, a great way to use your smartphone, and a great way to use your binoculars and spotting scopes in a new and exciting way. So as introduced, my name is Drew McCarthy. I'm originally from Anchorage, Alaska, although I've been living in Idaho since 2015. I studied geology at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and I got my master's in education at the University of Alaska Anchorage. After I finished my undergrad, I worked for a while as a geologist, but eventually ended up joining the US Peace Corps and served in the country of Kenya as an environmental education volunteer. What an amazing experience. One of the contributors to that project was the World Wildlife Fund. So working with WWF started for me as a Peace Corps volunteer almost 20 years ago. So it's exciting to still be working with WWF today as an expedition leader with Natural Habitat Adventures. After serving in the Peace Corps, I worked as an environmental planner for the National Park Service, and it was a lot of time behind a desk. I was doing a lot of policy work, and it was frankly not feeding my soul. So I got my master's in education, started down the road of teaching and guiding. I've been guiding since 2007. I first started guiding for a company in Alaska called Camp Denali North Face Lodge. I've been working with Natural Habitat since 2017. Leading trips in Yellowstone, summer and winter, and leading trips in Greenland during the late summer and fall. So during my guiding, I do end up using digiscoping quite a bit. It's a great way to easily capture images and share those images with the world. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with the presentation here. I have this image showing me next to one of the buses that I spent many years driving while working as a naturalist and a guide in Denali. A big part of my job in Denali was leading people off trail in the backcountry on guided hikes. And so I was always very concerned about what I was carrying. So large photography, lots of photography equipment was not always an option. I was always carrying binoculars though, and I was excited to learn that I could actually capture images through my binoculars using smartphone as my guiding progressed. Another big part of my job was driving these buses. So I spent a lot of time behind the wheel of these buses. 2 days a week, I drove in and out 90 miles along the Denali Park Road. And what an opportunity to encounter wildlife up close and personal. But more often than not, it was far away and impersonal. And that was another place where digiscoping was quite useful for me. I could, in the controls of the bus, I could have my binoculars around my neck. I could have my camera on the dashboard, and I could still be safely driving that bus. So that was kind of where digiscoping first became a part of my daily practice as a guide. And it's become a part of my daily life as well. Anytime I'm out hiking or skiing, backpacking, I've always got binoculars, and I almost always have my smartphone with me now as well. So this is an image that was taken last summer through my binoculars while driving buses in Denali, training some of our new drivers. This is a classic digiscoping image. One of the things that jumps out is this vignette around the edges of the image. You can crop that out down the road when you do some editing and processing, but you'll see in some of my pictures that there are these vignettes. None of these pictures have been edited aside from some cropping. I've done very little post-processing with the images that I'll share with you today. The reason is I want you to see what you can get through the lens of your scope, through your binoculars, without being processed. So I'm going to go ahead and show a few more photos. This picture was taken from behind the wheel of a bus. My subject, this bull moose in Denali in the early summer, was maybe 10 meters away. This was taken through my binoculars using an adapter, allowing me to use my smartphone to take this photo. This particular photo was taken in a burst. So I took a series of maybe 10 or 15 photos and was able to capture that moment, that interesting moment when this moose is just peeling away the willows. You can see it slower incisors. An intimate moment like that is really hard to capture without a series of shutter releases. And so a smartphone ends up being a powerful tool for this type of photography. Now this photo, this is a spruce grouse. And this photo was taken also in Alaska. This was also on the side of a roadway, but this was at a greater distance. This was taken with a spotting scope. A tripod was set up. The phone, the camera, the smartphone was attached to the scope, and this image was captured. Now again, no post-processing has been done with this image. You could probably brighten up the subject, which in this case is the spruce grouse, and we'll talk about that a little bit down the road. I did want to mention though, that again, this was taken at some distance. One of the big advantages to a smartphone in terms of photography is the ability to capture images in low light conditions. This was sort of a shady campground. An SLR, a regular camera, would have some challenges capturing this image. A smartphone, because of its ability to capture light in low light situations, was a good tool for this particular job. So what is digiscoping? Well, plainly, digiscoping is simply a photography technique using some sort of digital camera with a spotting scope or a pair of binoculars to take a picture. Digiscoping has been around for 10, maybe 15 years now, and just a brief history. It started with people using their point and shoot cameras and using a spotting scope and taking photos through their point and shoot cameras. It was used a lot by birders. Birders actually, of course, very interested in getting a close-up view of their subject. Birds are typically quite hard to photograph, but they're hard to identify. You know, many birds obviously have somewhat obscure markings, making identification difficult. So birders were beginning to take their scopes out in the field along with their smartphone, or I'm sorry, along with their point and shoots, and they were able to capture photos. A point and shoot camera is lightweight. It's relatively inexpensive. You can use it for landscape photography. You can take pictures of your friends. You could also use it with the scope to take telephoto pictures. Didn't take long for people to begin using their SLR cameras. That's the more traditional camera, attaching that to a scope. Not long after that, camera and scope manufacturers began evolving and actually creating adapters which would allow you to take your SLR, plug it into your scope, and grab some incredible photos. And what really was special about that was the ability to take high definition video through your SLR camera. That's when things really got rolling. Now, the most popular way of digiscoping is with a smartphone and an adapter. So here we've got a couple, I'm showing you here, a smartphone and an adapter. Many phone manufacturers as well as scope manufacturers are making adapters to allow you to use your smartphone. So there's some other terms I want to introduce really quickly. You'll hear people talk about digibinning. That's attaching a smartphone to your binoculars. We'll talk about that in this presentation. You also hear people use the term phonescoping as opposed to digiscoping. And the idea behind phonescoping is that it's specific to a smartphone and a spotting scope or binoculars versus any other digital camera device like an SLR or a point and shoot. I tend to use the term phonescoping more often, so you'll hear me during this presentation. I'll refer mostly to phonescoping. Lastly, I want to talk a little bit about the advantages of photography with the smartphone. I already mentioned the low ability to take photos in low light conditions. One big advantage is you've always got it with you. Every photographer knows that in order to get a good photo, you've got to have your camera and you've got to take a lot of pictures. Today, our modern lifestyles where a lot of us always have a smartphone with them, So just the ability to always have that camera available. Also, smartphones have a lot of other tools that are useful in natural history, bird guides, etc. And then lastly, the photo that's taken with a smartphone is geolocated. So it has some place identification with it as part of the photo that's taken. So it makes organizing your photos after the fact easier, less complicated when you take the photo with a smartphone. So I want to talk a little bit with you all about my personal setup for Phonescoping. You can see in the upper right-hand corner, that's my spotting scope and tripod. Attached to that is an adapter with my smartphone. I personally use iPhones. In the lower left, you can see my binoculars. It's actually the same adapter for my iPhone, but a different eyepiece, and so I'll show you all that here shortly. In the upper left-hand corner, you can see an image that was taken from Denali, a place called Highway Pass, and there's a group of maybe 80 to 100 caribou. That photo was taken just with my smartphone out the window of the bus. The lower right is that same group of caribou taken using my adapter and my binoculars. So you can see, obviously, there's a real advantage. You get that telephoto effect. The image in the lower right is one of my all-time favorite pictures I've ever taken. Looking at those caribou, it just reminds me of people on a beach hanging out in the sun. Their towels sprawled out, you know, suntan lotion. But in this case, the caribou are on the snowfield trying to get away from insects and trying to stay cool in the summer sun. So I want to show you some photos that I've taken and talk about some of the uses for Phonescoping. One of the more obvious uses of Phonescoping, of course, is to just capture some great close-up photos. So the title of this presentation was advertised, How to Get Close-Up Wildlife Photos with Your Smartphone. Well, here's just exactly that. This was a sow grizzly. She had 2 cubs with her, actually, that were second-year cubs. I'll show you some pictures of them later in the presentation. This photo, in some ways, is almost too close. There's a time when a telephoto, whether you're Phonescoping or you've got your SLR, sometimes a camera is just too much magnification and you lose the background, you lose the context. So even though the subject here of this photo is this really beautiful bear that's clearly looking at the horsetails, the vegetation growing on the side of the road, you lose the context. It was almost too close. Another use for Phonescoping is for birders, which I already mentioned. This particular bird in the lower portion of the frame, this is an orange-crowned warbler. Now this is a bird that's actually quite hard to identify. There's another bird that shares a similar habitat, these kind of willow thickets. Another warbler called the Arctic warbler looks very similar from a distance. So one of the uses for Phonescoping is to capture a quick photo, maybe even a quick video, and then view that on your screen in the moment and zoom in and be able to say, hey, I see that orange crown. That's an orange-crowned warbler. That's not an Arctic warbler. Taking a video allows you to get the call as well. So you can replay the song, maybe even capture some behavior of those birds to help you differentiate. Also, birds are notoriously difficult photography subjects. They're skittish. So having the ability to Phonescope, whether you use a spotting scope or binoculars, capture that photo from a distance. You don't disturb the bird. This particular bird, this photo was taken in Greenland. This is in Kulasuk. This bird is called a red phalarope, but it's in its adult non-breeding plumage, so it's not quite as distinctive. So taking a photo can help to identify what that bird is, help you with your bird guide zoom in and better identify your subject. Another use for Phonescoping in research. So this is a photo of a pack of wolves called the Wapiti Lake Pack. This was taken in 2018, I want to say. You'll see a lot of researchers in Yellowstone in particular using Phonescoping as a tool to help identify packs. So they'll capture a photo of the packs and they'll look at the ratio of black pelage to white, or to gray pelage to white pelage, and that ratio is a way of identifying an individual pack. Another really useful purpose of Phonescoping is, for me at least, is for identifying plants, which seems a little bit unusual, but in Yellowstone in particular, in the winter, you have these boardwalks that you're confined to, but there's a lot of life that grows all winter long in these geyser basins. It's spectacular. This picture was taken in early February. This particular plant is called a sulfur buckwheat, and depending on the nutrients of the soil it's growing in, it presents in very different ways. So using my binoculars and an adapter and my smartphone, I took this picture from a distance, was able to get a nice close-up of this plant in a geyser basin, an area where you're not allowed to walk, and identify it as a sulfur buckwheat. Another big advantage to using a phone in conjunction with a spotting scope is that a lot of people have trouble with spotting scopes. You know, they're hard to use to line your eye up. The eye cups can be difficult. Focusing can be hard. So from a guiding standpoint, and for birding with your friends and neighbors at home, being able to attach a phone to the eyepiece of the spotting scopes allows multiple people to view that image. It's sharp, it's in focus, it's on the screen. It can view them all at the same time, as opposed to multiple people having to come in and align their eye to the eyepiece of the scope. Now, as naturalists, as wildlife lovers, one of the biggest concerns we have in the field is not disturbing wildlife. We want to experience that wildlife. We want to observe their behaviors. We just want to be amazed by the environment that we're in, but we want to keep a distance. And so Phonescoping is a way to observe and to capture wildlife from a distance without disturbing it. The thing that's worth noting is many national parks around the world have very strict wildlife viewing distance policies. This way you can adhere to all those rules and regulations and still get the images that you hope to get. So here we have a sow grizzly with 2 cubs. That's a picture taken from just with the smartphone, probably about 50 meters away, I would say. And here's a photo taken through my binoculars with the adapter attached. You can see this sow and 2 sprig cubs are completely undisturbed. They're eating bare flour. You can really get a sense of what those animals are doing in their environment. It's really stinking cute. I mean, they're 2 beautiful spring cubs, but from a distance, they barely even recognized that we were there as observers. Now, we'll see how this video works. There's a short video I want to show you. Another big advantage to Phonescoping is the ability to take videos, edit those videos, view those videos, you know, on your phone in the moment. Now, this is a picture that was taken, again, of the Wapiti Lake Pack. This was a calf bison that had been killed very close to the road. Now, this video was taken through a spotting scope. I'm gonna go ahead and play it and see how it works. I don't know if you'll be able to see that at home. You can just see that alpha female is walking past a subordinate wolf. And there's a moment in this video that is really special, but I really couldn't capture that moment until I replayed the video and took a freeze, a frame freeze of one particular frame of the video. Let me show you what that frame is. Right there. There's the moment. So you can see that subordinate wolf. It looks like it's snarling, but it's actually a sign of being somewhat submissive as it's feeding on this bison carcass. So big advantage to Phonescoping is being able to take short segments of video and take freezing shots from that video. Also, landscape photography can be really exciting with Phonescopes. This picture was taken in Greenland. These structures must have been half a kilometer away. I was sitting on a porch with my binoculars and an adapter and my smartphone attached to my binoculars. There's a telephoto effect called foreshortening, which we're experiencing here in this photo. Let me show you another one. This is that same telephoto effect. You've got the objects appear to be much closer together in this telephoto image taken through my binoculars and using an iPhone than they actually are in real life. These kayakers are quite a far distance from these arched icebergs. But taking the photo through my binoculars, using the foreshortening impacts of a telephoto shot, it kind of gives the illusion that they're much closer. Funny story about this picture, actually. I was leading a trip with Rachel Sullivan, one of my co-guides, And not long after this picture was taken, chunks of ice began to fall down from that arching iceberg. But because the kayakers were so far away, they barely even felt the waves. But this picture makes it feel like they were right under it. Another big use of phonescoping is bird photography or nature photography literally from your window. Now here I have a window looking out into a natural setting. If you're doing this at home, you may want to be a little careful where you point your camera or your scope. But in this case, I have a feeder out. I have this feeder up all winter through the spring and early summer. I have to take it down for bears during the summer, but middle to late summer. But you can see in the upper right of this image, you can see my phone adapter attached to the eyepiece of the spotting scope. And I've been able to get some really great photos over the years throughout the seasons of subjects at my feeder. So here we have a goldfinch that on a very windy early spring day was grabbing a sunflower seed. Upper right, you can see a family of robins, American robins. This is actually on the porch. In order for us to capture these images, I actually had to set the scope up in the house and point it out the window. And it was really only about 6 meters away. It was really the limit of what the scope would allow in terms of focusing. But we watched these robin nestlings grow day by day. We actually witnessed them fledge, which was an incredibly special experience. Enough said there. Here's a couple other photos taken from my spotting scope here in the living room. Got a black-headed grosbeak migrant that comes through here, as well as some Cassin's finches having a bit of a party on the feeder. So I hope that some of you come away with this presentation with a desire to do some photography right out your home windows, because nature is literally at our doorsteps and you can capture it every day. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about my personal setup for my scope, and then I'll also talk about my binoculars, and then I'm going to go ahead and demonstrate the setup for you here. Hopefully you'll be able to see that on the video and see how really pretty simple it is. So from left to right, I want to talk about some of the anatomy of the spotting scope. The sunshade is very important. Any light that happens to be cast, whether it's from an overhead light in your home or the sun outside, will actually reflect off that lens and can impact your image. So you want to make sure your sunshade is out. You want to have a tripod. It's critically important when phone scoping. And you want a tripod head that both vertically and horizontally adjusts. So we'll talk about that. Of course, the focus is at the waist of the scope here in this picture. The zoom is on the eyepiece. This particular scope, this is a ATS 80, a Swarovski, and it has a zoom range of 20 times to 60 times. So it'll enlarge the real world 60 times through your eyepiece. I'll talk a little more about zooming in a moment. Then finally, the eye cup is what goes right up against your eye. Now, this is my setup for binoculars. And again, you'll hear people refer to this often as digibinning. I personally take more photos through my binoculars than my spotting scope because I always have the binoculars with me. The downside of binoculars is it's difficult to stabilize the image. They can shake around quite a bit because you don't have a tripod. The eye cups end up being pretty important when attaching an adapter, so I wanted to point out the eye cups with this particular pair of binoculars. And then finally, the phone adapter. It's the same whether it's the same adapter whether I'm using my binoculars or my scope, just different eyepieces, and I'll show you that here in a moment. In fact, let me jump over to video now and see how this works. All right, let's try this. So you can see my scope over there behind me. These are the two different eyepieces that I can use whether I'm using my binoculars or I can use whether I'm using my scope. This is the adapter that's made by Swarovski. And we'll talk about other adapters that are a little bit more user-friendly. This is an iPhone. This happens to be an iPhone 6S. This is an old phone that is actually, I don't use it as a telephone anymore, but I keep it with me as sort of my field photography phone. So I have it all set up for me to photograph when I need it. So you just slide the adapter on. It's got a leash, which is important. Phones are expensive. You don't want to drop them. And then in this case, since I'm going to demonstrate the scope, I'm going to use the larger eyepiece and just thread that onto the adapter. All right. The other thing I'm going to take with me here is a set of earbuds, Apple earbuds, and I'll show you why here in a moment. So here's my scope. Feeder's outside, and I've got my adapter here. I'm going to put it around my neck so I don't drop it, hopefully. So I've got my sunshade out. You can see this slides in and out. Most scopes have a sunshade, and I really don't forget to use that. It's pretty important for capturing good photos. I'm going to do my focus adjustment with the tripod before I attach my adapter. Now the tripod is pretty important. You want to disconnect anything from the tripod that can catch the wind. That's because it'll move the scope as you're trying to photograph. So take away any straps, anything that might catch the wind, any luggage tags, NatHab, luggage tag. You want to adjust your scope on your subject here. Let's see. So I've got a black-capped chickadee here on the feeder, and I'm going to focus first. Now I talked about zoom, so I focused on my subject. With zoom, I want to be as wide angle as possible. In this case, 20 times. The scope goes from 20 to 60, but I want 20 times because I want as much light coming into the camera as I can, so I want as wide a view as possible. I'm going to roll the eye cup out. In this case, this scope, rolling the eye cup in is a clockwise motion. So when I attach my adapter, I'm going to attach it in such a way that the weight of the phone won't twist the eye cup in. I found that it helps to just kind of moisten the eyepiece a little bit to get the adapter on there. You just slide it on. It takes a bit of force. And then just set your phone to its camera setting. All right, so in my camera, you can't see it now, but I have my chickadee in view, and I'm going to go ahead and take a couple pictures. Now I can push the button on the screen, but that shakes the scope, right? You don't want to do that. So one way to avoid shaking the scope is to use your earbuds. So you attach the earbuds just as if you were going to use them to listen to music, but you're going to use the volume control to take the photo. So my chickadee has now departed, but I still have the feeder in sight. So I'm just going to take a couple photos. And that's happening just by using either the plus or the minus button on the earbuds. And I've got my photos. Now, let me show you what I got here. I'm going to take this away. There we go. Unplug the headphones. Set the scope aside. So a couple photos here, and I realize that you won't be able to see much here, but it gives you the sense. Looks like I didn't even get one bird in my photos, but you get the idea. So that's Phonescoping through a spotting scope. Many different spotting scopes will work. I want to emphasize that. We'll talk a little bit more about how to figure out what's appropriate equipment for your particular scope here in a moment. But that's the basics of the Phonescoping side of it. Now, let's talk about Digibinning. So here I've got my binoculars. Any pair of binoculars can work for this. Bushnells, Nikons, Swarovskis, it doesn't matter. But what matters is, you do want, it's better if you have decent optics, but a $300 pair of binoculars, even a $150 pair of binoculars these days can get you some really pretty good optics. So this is my iPhone 8. This is what I tend to use most often. And I just take the case off it that I use for every day. I want to clean the lens to make sure I don't have any fingerprints on the lens. Now, I want to share with you my recommended adapter for Phonescoping, whether you're using binoculars or a spotting scope. Now, it's made by a company called Phonescope, and you order the eyepiece and the adapter separately for your particular device. So this is an adapter for an iPhone 8. Just going to clip the phone in there, like so. Now I'm going to attach the adapter, the eyepiece. Just rolls on like that. Now when I attach it to the binoculars, lens cap's off. It's pretty important. And then I want to roll one eye cup down and one eye cup up. And I'm going to attach the Phonescope adapter to the eye cup that is elevated. Now this is a trick. You can actually extend the other eye cup to sort of hold your phone in place. That way now the phone itself won't roll or slide as you view through the binoculars. So you want to turn the phone on, bring up your photo app. Now, you can take photos simply by pushing the button on the screen, but another way, if you are, say, following a flying bird, you can use the volume buttons on your phone as a shutter release. So you can be panning across, watching a bird, focusing not on the button on the screen, but just keep your thumb resting on the volume button, and that way you can take a series of photos as you're panning more easily and more quickly. So always important to have your binoculars strap around your neck because binoculars are expensive. Same with your adapter. It's always good to have a leash around your neck as well. So let's head back to the PowerPoint presentation. All right. Okay, so there's the image of my binoculars with the adapter and the phone on it. Let me keep going here. So just some points to emphasize about Phonescoping with the scope, the first thing I demonstrated. So again, a stable tripod with horizontal and vertical adjustments. You can weight the base. If it's a windy day, you can actually hook a weight to the base of the tripod to keep it from moving in the wind, and remove any loose straps. Extend the eye cup, use the sunshade. Start out with a wide angle. So if your scope has a zoom, start at 20 times. If you move it up to 60 times, you'll get more magnification, but you might not get as much light. Your picture might not be as crisp. Because vibration comes into play, with that magnification, you might end up with some blurring. So I tend to use 20 times. And then if I want to enlarge, I do that in the post-processing after the photo's been taken. First, focus with the spotting scope, then attach the adapter. Tap the screen in order to choose a spot on the field of the screen that you want the camera to be focused on, and then also where you want the exposure to be set from. So I'll talk more about that in a second. Finally, consider using your earbuds as a shutter release or remote. Here's some points to consider with the Digibinning. That's using your binoculars. Remember, always wear your binocular strap. You don't want to drop your binoculars. There's a lot of bits and pieces to handle. Extend one eye cup and then the other eye cup to help secure the adapter to the binoculars. Focus with the binoculars. Then, as I was describing with the Phonescoping, tap the screen. That way, you know that this phone is focusing off a particular point in the field and setting exposure as well. Use the volume button as a shutter release, the volume button on your phone. One thing I didn't talk about, because when digibinning, you don't have the ability to use a tripod, use your slow motion setting. So you're essentially taking a video through your binoculars, but in slow motion. That way, what's produced is a lot less shaky. It's a lot less difficult to view. And if you're trying to freeze a frame from that slow motion video, it's a lot easier to do than a regular video. So consider slow motion setting when digibinning or using your binoculars together with an iPhone and an adapter. Now, I want to encourage improvising as necessary. So the image on the left, you can see I had an old tripod and scope that I've had around for a long time. if you primarily are taking photos through your binoculars, if you don't have a spotting scope, you can always attach your binoculars to a stable surface or to the head of a spotting scope. In this case, I used a couple ski straps just to hold my binoculars in place. That way the vibration is taken out of the picture and you can get a crisp photo through your binoculars without an actual tripod attachment. And then the image on the right, this is again, it's actually a perfectly good scope. These scopes are older. You can get an adapter. Phonescope will allow you to purchase an adapter for even an older scope like this. So if you've got an old spotting scope in your basement, if you see one at the thrift store, if you've got a tripod in your basement, get those things out, dust them off, start experimenting. I bet you'll find you get some pretty surprisingly good photos. So I want to talk a little bit about some iPhone tips here, iPhone photography tips. So, you know, I want to emphasize that again, when you're taking pictures through a scope, you want to have the field of view as large as possible on the scope. So, as I described behind us, 20 times versus 60 times. You can though zoom on the screen, and everybody knows you can use 2 fingers to enlarge the screen, but you can also put your finger on that little yellow circle, slide that up and down to enlarge the screen. Maybe you're not actually taking a photo, but you're using the screen on the smartphone as a viewfinder so that you're sharing with your friends and family what's being viewed through the scope. I tend to zoom in using the phone in those circumstances just to allow for viewing and enjoyment as opposed to photography. Now switching back to photography, in the lower half of this slide, you can see one thing that it's pretty interesting to note. When you tap your screen using an iPhone, on the section of the screen that you want the subject of the photo to be, you'll get that little yellow box. Well, there's a little yellow sun next to the box which you can actually slide up and you can slide down in order to underexpose or overexpose the image before you hit the shutter. So experiment with that. That little sun actually slides with your fingertip and will either overexpose or underexpose the image before you take the picture. Let's see here. Here we go. So a couple more photography tips. I already mentioned using slow-mo. That's very useful when using digibinning, binoculars in particular. Time-lapse setting is pretty interesting to play with. Time-lapse allows you to compress, say, I don't know, 5 minutes into 30 seconds. And I can show you an example of where that's pretty interesting on a bird feeder. Video, you can take some really beautiful videos. iPhones and other smartphones in particular work well in low light. I found that the video actually is almost better in low light. So if you're trying to view distant wolves in low light settings, using the video can really improve the image on the screen of your smartphone. Excuse me. Lastly, I want to talk a little bit about shutter release. So photo burst, again, is pretty useful. I showed you that image with the moose. By holding the shutter release button down, whether by pressing on the screen or the volume button, if you press it and hold it, it'll take a burst for as long as you hold that button down. You can then go through all those photos and choose that one photo that really captured the moment, that really was the spirit of the subject you were photographing. Sorry. And then I just want to emphasize again the use of earbuds as a shutter release. That way you don't shake the spotting scope while you're taking the photo. Also, if you search on Amazon or other online retailers, you can find all sorts of remote shutter releases that are designed for Android or for iOS or iPhones, and they're wireless, so they allow you to connect using Bluetooth and take your photos that way. All right, so here is a time lapse that I just want to share with you. This is about 5 minutes at my feeder just out the window here, compressed into 15 seconds. And I think there's 5 species of birds that we end up encountering in this time lapse. So you've got a black-capped chickadee, a red-breasted nuthatch, a red-breasted nuthatch, black-capped chickadee, mountain chickadee, somewhere in there. There's a couple grosbeaks And then just a cameo of a downy woodpecker shows up in that time lapse. So again, that was probably about 5 minutes compressed into 15 seconds. So I want to talk a little bit about photo editing. One of the beauties of photography in the field with a smartphone is that you've essentially got a computer with you. That smartphone is a computer. Snapseed is an app that's available in the App Store. It's free. It's usable on both Android and iOS systems. It has all the friendly and familiar tools and filters that those of you that use Instagram might be familiar with. But it also has customizable, tunable effects that you can design yourself and then use to take future photos. Also, the nice thing about Snapseed is it's basically it's like the power of having Photoshop, which is a desktop-based photo editing program, in your smartphone. So it has a lot of professional level editing tools. You can adjust the white balance, you can distort and stretch, you can work with photos in RAW. So check out Snapseed as an app for photo editing. It works with both iPhones and Android smartphones. Now I mentioned Phonescope, the company that has the scope and adapters available for binoculars and for spotting scopes. This is their website. And essentially, you just go to the website, you identify which phone you have. You can see here over on the left, I have an Apple, an iPhone 8. And then it asks you, are you trying to mate this to binoculars or spotting scopes? If you click either of those options, it'll give you all sorts of makes and models of binoculars and spotting scopes. You choose, let's say you have a Zeiss, you select Zeiss and the model, and they'll automatically recommend for you the adapter and the eyepiece necessary for your device or your pair of spotting scopes or binoculars. The other thing I really want to point out, if you look over on the right side of the screen, you can see there's an option for a universal optic adapter. So Phonescope also has some really user-friendly universal adapters, which you still need to select that you want an adapter for a particular phone, say an iPhone or a Google phone, but the adapter, the eyepiece, will adjust. So you can attach it to a number of different scopes, say in rapid succession. So that's worth looking at as well. I will say they don't fit quite as well as a specific eyepiece for a specific scope or binocular. The other thing to keep in mind is you can order a custom adapter. That's what the lower right is indicating. If you have an old spotting scope, say that isn't listed as one of the options on their website, you simply measure the ocular diameter and give them the brand and give them the make if you've got it, and they will match as best they can an eyepiece for that particular spotting scope. So you could have a spotting scope from the 70s and likely find an eyepiece using the Phonescope website that would allow you to mate it to an adapter. Here you can see the adapter that I have, and the eyepiece is about 30 bucks. The adapter is about 50 bucks. It's still a little on the expensive side, but you won't be disappointed with the results of the photos you can get using these products. Okay, so if you're interested in more information on the world of digiscoping, phonescoping, digibinning, whatever, you can look on, of course, YouTube. YouTube has a digiscoping channel with a lot of good instructional videos. Swarovski Optic has some really great tutorials that go into more of the minutia, more of the detail to phonescoping and digiscoping. And then finally, phonescope.com, Phonescope with a K. That's the company where you can order the adapters and the eyepieces for your individual devices. So I want to share with you a couple more photos before we begin to transition this presentation into a little bit of a question and answer format. This photo was taken in Glacier National Park last summer. This actually was taken through a spotting scope with my iPhone 8, and I did not have an adapter. So it is possible to hold your phone very steadily to the eyepiece and manage to capture some photos, but it takes a lot of practice, and frankly, it's not even really worth your time if you go to the effort to order an adapter and an eyepiece for your particular phone. Anyway, this is a great photo of some American bison in the early summer in Glacier. You can see there's a calf nursing in the background. You've got that young bull in the foreground. That foreshortening effect of distance really makes for a powerful image. Now, this was actually taken just weeks ago. This is in the National Elk Refuge in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. These are Rocky Mountain bighorn sheep. This picture was taken on a morning when it was cold, 17 degrees below Fahrenheit. Incredibly calm air, no wind, very clear as you can see. This photo was taken, my scope was zoomed in 60 times, which I've been telling you to avoid doing that, but because I had such good light, such calm conditions, such clear air, I was able to zoom it into 60 and still grab a fairly good photo of these bighorns. This photo, I mean, this was close to, I bet, almost 3/4 of a kilometer away. This photo was taken with my binoculars in Denali, using that Phonescope adapter in my iPhone 8. This is a red fox, and I didn't even realize when I took this series of photos, looking back later, that that fox has an Arctic ground squirrel tucked in its mouth. In fact, you can actually make out the expression of that unhappy ground squirrel as it's carried back to the den to be a meal for some kits. Again, didn't even realize that the ground squirrel was in the mouth of the fox. Now, I mentioned earlier in the presentation about that sow grizzly that had 2 cubs. These are the cubs from that grizzly. I love this photo. The lines of their legs, the motion, the movement, but also the black eye masks of these very bandit-looking second-year cubs. These cubs, at the end of this summer, would have moved on away from their mom, but really a lot of personality in that photo. And frankly, those cubs had a lot of personality. They played for about 2 or 3 minutes in the middle of the road. Kind of wrapping up toward the end of our presentation here, I wanted to show you this image taken of a raven. You know, this photo was taken very close to a nest where year after year, driving past this nest in the spring, predictably, this pair of ravens, would build a nest and fledge chicks. I think the reason that they liked that spot was that the buses, as they would pass, would drive over Arctic ground squirrels, and so the ravens didn't even have to work. They'd just wait for the buses to move on, and they'd fly down and pick up the remains of these ground squirrels and feed it to their chicks. So these ravens, this very same raven I probably photographed multiple seasons in a row. Now I want to finish up this portion of the presentation and move into some question and answer with this video. And I want to highlight to you to be really careful when you take these videos through your iPhones and scopes, because remember, audio is recording as well. Now that can be to your advantage if you're trying to record a bird song, but it's going to record everything that's being said in the immediate area. So just be careful when you take videos. So I'm going to play this for you. This was taken, I think this was last fall, 2019, in the Lamar Valley of Yellowstone. And here's a pack of wolves waking up here in the morning.
13, yeah. Yeah. So it's a meet and greet.
It's like all of us at breakfast. Good morning.
Who should we go kill today?
Morning poops and
Right?
Yeah.
Checking their P-mail.
Yeah, we got a spot over here. Nice. Okay. Yeah, if anybody wants to go to that
oh, yeah, they're the lighter ones as well.
Did you see those yesterday? Well, I didn't. You probably did.
So this little bit of video must have, I bet it was almost 3 minutes, and I just coalesced it down to an interesting little section. But to be able to watch these wolves going about their greetings and their social interactions through the scope like that, and then to be able to record it, just adds so much value to the experience and so much power to your trips, to your personal outings, and to hopefully to your day-to-day lives. So I very much appreciate you all joining me today. And hopefully I've given you a good introduction to some of the nuts and bolts of Phonescoping. But I'd love to field some questions so I can pass it back over to Lee, and we can address some questions.
All right. Well, Drew, thank you so much. Man, this is a hot topic. Everybody is so excited. We even have some folks who have never owned an iPhone who are now ready to go out and get one just so they can do this. So it's pretty cool. And I also wanted to say a big hi to you from some of your past travelers. Drew and Lynette are here, or Drew from Lynette is here, and no, sorry, Lynette and John are here. Good grief.
Hey
Lynette
guys.
and John are here, and Joe and Samita are here, and they were on your Greenland trip, so they're excited to be here again.
They might have been in one of those pictures.
Yeah. So, all right. Now that I've got my brain connected with my mouth, I can ask you some real questions here. What do you think about using a polarizer?
Well, the polarizers are powerful tools in more traditional photography. Any lens in an SLR camera has a threaded fitting that allows you to attach a filter or a polarizer. A spotting scope, or a pair of binoculars, like the tools that I demonstrated with today, unfortunately don't have the ability that I know of to thread a polarizer on there. Now, you could probably hold a polarizing filter up to the end of the spotting scope, but anytime you do something like that, you're going to introduce vibration, which is going to work against your photo ultimately in the end. I should note that I am not, though I love taking photos, and I don't consider myself a very experienced photographer. It is possible that in the world of digiscoping, those filters are very much available, but I've never encountered them. And I also want to note that so much post-processing capability is built into these phones now, depending on the apps that you choose. Some of the polarizing effect that filter might provide you, you can actually recreate after the fact in your software on the device.
Okay. All righty. Lots of requests for recommendations about scope or type of scope that you would recommend, and whether you really do need a tripod.
You definitely need a tripod for taking photos through a spotting scope. Anybody that's ever tried to hold a spotting scope and look through it without being able to at least rest it on a windowsill, it's nearly impossible to look through a scope without it being stabilized by a tripod. Tripods are often overlooked, I think, in the world of photography as well as in the world of digiscoping. And it's actually worth, if you're looking to make an investment in some equipment, a really good quality scope goes a long way. Especially in wildlife viewing, having the ability to easily adjust vertical and horizontal orientation of that scope head and pan smoothly and lock it in place, it's worth spending some money on the scope head itself. That's the nuts and bolts, that's the guts of the scope. As far as brands of scopes and binoculars, I think some of the best lower priced binoculars out there are made by Nikon. The Monarch is a really great binocular. It's just under $200, but it is incredibly crisp. The optics are really quite good. Another good company for binoculars, Vortex makes some nice binoculars. Those are what we use with our guests on our guided outings with NatHab, and everybody loves them. They're pretty durable, and they have quite good optics for their price. Vortex is also a good company to look into for spotting scopes. So Swarovski has incredible optics, and certain things about the Swarovskis are quite nice. There's a very large focus ring, which allows you to do really fine adjustments with your focus that some other scopes that have a smaller focusing ring, you can't quite do it because that smaller diameter focusing ring, it moves too quickly. But Vortex is a nice balance. Their optics are really quite good. They're much less expensive than a lot of other scopes. After this presentation, I'd be happy to provide Kendall or Lee some specific recommendations of scopes, down to the model. But I do, in general, I would point you down the road of Vortex if you're looking to in sort of the mid-range. If you're looking to really jump in up to your neck. Swarovski is just incredible optics. Zeiss scopes are quite nice with quite good optics. But yeah, I'd be happy to produce some specific models for folks via email after the presentation.
Okay, that'd be great. Thank you. The adapter, is it universal or is it specific or do you need to purchase by brand?
It is. You do need to purchase by brand. So if you go to the Phonescope website, you can. It's a very user-friendly interface where you select the binocular type and the model, as well as the phone, and down to the model, and then they'll send you. Based on those specifications you provide, they'll send you the right adapter and the right eyepiece. The other nice thing I'll say about Phonescope products is the ability to easily remove the eyepiece from the phone adapter. So for instance, if you're using a spotting scope and you have the eyepiece attached, you can leave the eyepiece on the scope or binoculars and still use them normally without the phone, and then just simply reattach the phone to the existing adapter that's still on the eyepiece. I would suggest visiting the Phonescope website where a lot of this is illustrated through some videos. But to answer the question, long story short, you do need to know the specific binocular and the specific phone in order to get the right product.
Okay. All right, thank you. Just making a note, I do see that I am watching the clock and I do want to ask you a few more questions. If anyone does need to leave, we will be sending the replay out so you can review any information you might have missed, but we've got a couple more, if you don't mind, Drew, I want to ask.
Nope, not at all.
Okay. How do you reconcile autofocus of the phone with the manual focus of the scope?
You know, it often feels a bit like a competition, because, you know, iPhones in particular, they're constantly sort of, you can tell they're constantly adjusting in their brains, adjusting the focus, and particularly with scopes, when you're zoomed at a very, very distant object and there's, say, a lot of heat rising up off the landscape, you get those sort of waves of distortion, and that's going to cause your phone to constantly adjust. It's not as much of an issue. You'll learn over time that there's certain conditions that are optimal for Phonescoping or for Digiscoping. And that situation where I was describing that morning when it was 17 below Fahrenheit, extremely clear and calm, in those conditions, it's very easy to focus with the spotting scope first, and then attach the iPhone or the smartphone of your choice. And you'll notice there's very little of that competitive focus happening. But I don't know of a way to autofocus lock, for instance, on an iPhone. But that's a great question. But I don't know. I don't have an immediate answer as to whether there's a way to autofocus lock. But conditions is what it really gonna come down to. Looking for the calmest, clearest conditions will help minimize that competitive focusing.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So you've talked about how you've done this with several versions of the iPhone. We have an iPhone 11 Pro Max person with us, and it has 3 lenses. Have you done any work with those? Do you have any tips on how you focus in on through just one of the lenses?
Well, I don't have one of the newer iPhone versions, but I do know that there's 3 lenses, but really there's the lens with a similar configuration to all the older iPhones, which is primarily when you're just using the photo setting, or the panoramic setting. It's using the same lens as what was on the older iPhones. Those additional lenses are more for portrait photography. This is, again, my limited knowledge, but most likely when you've got one of those newer phones, if you're on photo setting, if you're on, say, landscape setting or panorama, you're essentially using just one of the 3 lenses all the time. Those other two lenses are really more specialized for either close-up macro photography or portrait photography, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, good, thanks. Okay, so just a couple more questions and then we'll wrap it up. We have one here. It says, for digiscoping, is an adapter necessary or can you simply just hold the phone up to the binoculars?
Well, for digiscoping through a spotting scope, you do not need an adapter. It is possible with some practice to become really quite proficient and fast at holding the phone up to the eyepiece and taking photos without the adapter. But it's such a relatively low investment to get the adapter in the eyepiece, and it allows you to take the focus of your brain and efforts away from holding that phone in just the right spot, and allows you to put your efforts into composing that photo or catching that warbler right when it's singing, right when its beak is open. So I really do suggest that minimal investment of the adapter, because then you can think about taking the photo and not think about holding the phone.
Sure. Okay, that makes sense. All right, I am going to stop there and I'm going to turn it back to you, Drew, for closing comments.
Well, thank you again for this opportunity. I want to say how exciting it is to know that some of my previous guests are out there in the audience. I hope you're doing very well given these difficult situations. And I really hope that people can realize that there is magnificent nature happening just 10 feet out your door, and utilizing your iPhone either as a telescopic photography device or as a macro photographic device will really add to your appreciation of nature on a day-to-day basis. So get out there, get photos and share them with your friends, and let's make the most of the time we've got.
Oh, thank you, Drew. That was a terrific presentation, and we thank all of you for being with us. We've got a whole new set of topics next week. You'll be getting an email if you haven't already about those. We would love to have you with us next week for our next set of Daily Dose of Nature. We've got a 102 photography session, a Yellowstone session. We're going to talk about Borneo, our next session on the gray whale, and ending the week with Madagascar. So lots to talk about, and we hope you'll join us. And with that, we'll say good day and conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody. Thanks, Drew.